Share our burden. The journey is long. The journey is long. The journey is Come uplift us. Come uplift us. Come uplift us. Come uplift us. The journey is long. The journey is long. The journey is long. The journey is long. Give us peace. Give us peace. Give us peace. Give us peace. The journey is long. The journey is long. The journey is long. The journey is long. Good job, y'all. Yeah, thanks, Mimi. Okay, if the children will come forward, it's time with Katie. Number one. Let us hear the word as it comes to us from Mark 10:35 through 45. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied to him, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand and at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
I'm going to get this as close to my mouth as possible. There we go. Okay. Good morning. I have to tell a very brief story to start this morning. The fact that this passage makes me laugh because near the end of it, the other disciples, they get mad at James and John for having brought this up, even though Jesus didn't promise to James and John that they would get this power that they asked for. They're kind of mad that they even asked. And I picture it as something that reminds me of like when if I was trying out for a solo in the choir or something along those lines, and somebody just went right out and asked for it, and then they got chosen to have it, and I was just like trying to be really good at singing and hope to be noticed, and I would get mad like, I didn't know that was an option, like I could just ask. And I picture the disciples being mad, like they were like, if we had known that we could have asked for power, we would have been doing it this whole time. And so that's what I picture in this story, and I really picture the disciples. They squabble a lot in these chapters, and I think that's something we sometimes miss. It's quite humorous, actually. Last week in his sermon, Pastor Scott preached from Mark 8, in which Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah. And that moment when Peter declares that is a turning point in the book of Mark. Jesus is the Messiah, and this knowledge that the disciples now have means that the disciples will treat him differently, as seen in this passage. James and John are asking for places in his coming kingdom. They assume, as Katie mentioned to the children, that Jesus will be an earthly ruler, will be a king. there were many messianic figures before Jesus, and they were all military leaders. So James and John would like to get in early. They want to be the early birds and voice their desire for that promotion for when the time comes. They're making sure to get in on the ground floor. It's actually quite wise if you are talking about a military campaign. They would like to have power in this coming kingdom. And it bears repeating that Jesus was not that kind of Messiah, but it's not surprising that James and John would have assumed that he would be. Jesus did not come to conquer through war and violence, but to sacrifice himself, as we hear at the end of this passage. Jesus, God incarnate, came to be a ransom for many. Jesus, the Messiah, did not come to be served, but to serve. This is the God that we worship. A God willing to empty God's self of all power to come and walk among the dirt, the animals, the people who poke and prod and call for his attention constantly, who follow him around in crowds and bother him even when he wants to just take a rest. This is the God we worship. When Jesus speaks of the least of these, of being last, in many ways he's speaking of himself. Jesus is divine, yet human. And not only human, but a humble, poor, itinerant preacher. This is the God we worship, a God willing to give up everything. It is often said that in the book of Mark, that the disciples don't have any idea what's going on. They're confused most of the time. And this is true, to some extent. They are definitely a foil to Jesus' knowledge. It's written that way to show that Jesus has the answers, the disciples do not. And one might wonder why Jesus doesn't just get fed up at this question that James and John asks, because it does seem so counter to everything he has done so far. I understand, he might understand that historically, messianic figures were warlike, but nothing Jesus has done thus far has been warlike. But one scholar points out that this passage, this question from James and John, parallels the very question that we discussed last week, the one that Peter, or the discussion that Peter has with Jesus in Mark 8. Peter understands so clearly that Jesus is the Messiah, but then immediately rebukes Jesus about his impending death. And the disciples throughout Mark, they're so close, and then they fall away. And then they're so close, and then they fall away. And I would really like to be able to make fun of the disciples for this, but honestly, it's very relatable. What's really important, more than the disciples falling away, more than us falling away, is the way that Jesus works. The way that God works means that this constant trying and failing and trying again and failing again and trying again, all of that doesn't push God away. We are not abandoned for that failure. We are not cast away. We may be filled with shame, but God is not ashamed of us. You might expect Jesus to get angry with James and John, and he does sometimes get frustrated with the disciples. Frustration is something that Jesus does feel. But instead, in this passage particularly, he takes the time to explain, to teach, to ponder with them, to ask a question. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? And honestly, he knows the answer to that question. He's asking it for their benefit. We humans, we try and we fail. We are sinners and we are saints at the same time. We shy away from the challenges that Jesus alludes to with his talk about his baptism and his cup. Doesn't sound very pleasant. We'd prefer not to. But God is eternal and does not fail. God does not abandon us for our trying and failing, for our misunderstandings of the message that God is sending to us. Instead, God looks at us and says, can you? Can you do this? Or, as I like to think of it, God looks at us and asks, are you ready? Are you ready? These words from Jesus that he says to the disciples, they're a bit alarming. The baptism and cup he speaks of do not sound great. It's a far cry from, "Come, all you are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Those things exist together, but this doesn't sound so good, right? It doesn't sound as comforting. Jesus is not promising ease, is not even promising a life of prestige and power. Jesus is promising actually the opposite. But he's asking, offering, inviting, not forcing or pushing, wondering, asking, are you ready? This is how God, the one who is willing to give up everything, that's how this God works. Not through coercion or manipulation, through simply asking. Jesus moved through the world with curious asking, this careful questioning, and even some outright declarations related to power, devotion, and love. The God we worship came to serve humanity in word and deed. And through lessons like this one, he did just that. God did just that. Through healings like that of Bartimaeus, which comes right after this passage. Through rebukes and encouragements, through walking alongside and radically changing, Jesus served the world. And ultimately, the world could not handle Jesus and his peaceful, radical, questioning ways. The powers of the world could not handle his care for the least that he speaks of in this passage, for his lifting up of the last. Many answered his question, "Are you ready?" with an enthusiastic yes, but that was seen as a threat to the powers. In Mark 11 and following, so right after this chapter, Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem and is met with shouts of joy that turn to shouts of "Crucify." It is in the events of that week that Jesus' predictions of his own death and following resurrection, this explanation that the Son of Man came to be a ransom for many, these things come true. We are saved by Jesus' full self, and every part of that is bound up in service of the world. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are bound together, and that is what saves us. This is what God, the one who is willing to give up everything, the one who simply asks, this is what God has done. God has saved us, and God has offered us grace. And God will transform us through that grace. God will take our broken pieces and put us back together. And of course, that won't be easy necessarily. Remember that Jesus told James and John they would drink from a painful cup and take part in a painful baptism. Remember that Jesus told the disciples that they must be last, must be least. And my friends, we've seen how the world treats the least. It's likely that each of us would rather not find ourselves in the least of these category. But imagine if we let God put us there. Imagine if we allowed ourselves to be transformed so that our pride and our haughtiness were washed away. So that we dropped our fixation on getting ahead, on being famous, or maybe just being powerful. Maybe we don't want to be famous. And instead focused on lifting everyone up. So that we change the very way that the world treats the very least that we are meant to be. The poor, the incarcerated, the sick. If we allowed ourselves to be transformed so that being the least wasn't a terrifying thought. God will do this. God will transform us so that we can transform the world into the kingdom Jesus preached about. God will transform us ever more toward God's ways so that we too will be willing to give up everything for love. So, my friends, the one who is willing to give up everything and the one who simply asks, are you ready? If we say yes, that same God who has saved us will take us further than we ever thought we could go by God's grace. I invite you to join me. Amen. Our hymn of response is in Sing the Journey, number 106, Just a Closer Walk with Thee.
Don't have my bulletin, but we will continue with the next song that is listed in your bulletin. Thank you, number 77.
So, my friends, may we go now, remembering that the God who is willing to give up everything for love, we cannot go anywhere where that God is not. Go in love, for love alone endures. Go with purpose, answering yes to that kind of scary question, are you ready? And my friends, go in peace, trusting that God's peace and grace will transform us. Amen.